The whiskey glasses stopped clinking the moment Eleanor Hayes told the young cowboy she was too old to be his bride at 35. The entire Silver Spur Saloon held its breath as 23-year-old ranch hand James Crawford looked at the widowed seamstress and said the 5 words that would change everything. "Ma'am, I only see beauty." The whiskey glasses stopped clinking the moment Eleanor Hayes told the young cowboy she was too old to be his bride at 35. The entire Silver Spur Saloon held its breath as 23-year-old ranch hand James Crawford looked at the widowed seamstress and said the 5 words that would change everything. "Ma'am, I only see beauty." The late afternoon sun streamed through the dusty windows of the Silver Spur, painting everything in shades of amber and gold, catching the motes of tobacco smoke that hung in the air like ghosts of words spoken and unspoken. For 2 weeks, the entire town of Billings had watched James Crawford court Eleanor Hayes with a determination that had bordered on madness, bringing her wildflowers every morning, walking her home from her seamstress shop each evening, sitting in the front pew at her church just to be near her. The whispers had followed them everywhere like a persistent wind, sharp-tongued women muttering about propriety and unseemly attractions, grizzled ranchers shaking their heads at the folly of youth chasing after a woman who had already buried one husband. But James had ignored them all with the quiet stubbornness of a man who knew his own mind, and today he had walked into the saloon where he knew Eleanor would be delivering mended shirts to the bartender, dropped to one knee in the sawdust-covered floor, and asked her to be his wife in front of 30 witnesses who suddenly forgot how to breathe. Eleanor's face had gone white as bleached muslin, then red as a summer sunset, her hands trembling so badly that the basket of shirts nearly tumbled from her grip. "Sir," she had said, her voice carrying across the silent room with the desperate firmness of a woman trying to save a drowning man from himself, "I appreciate your regard, but you must understand this is impossible. I am 35 years old. You are barely more than a boy. You deserve a young woman who can give you children, who can grow old alongside you rather than ahead of you." The shame in her voice was palpable, the mortification of being proposed to so publicly, so impossibly, by a man young enough to make the 12-year gap between them a scandal that would feed the town gossips for months. She had turned to leave, to flee this humiliation, when James had risen to his full height and spoken those 5 words that made every hardened cowboy in the saloon look away with suspiciously bright eyes. "Ma'am, I only see beauty." His voice was steady, clear, without a trace of youthful bravado or foolish romanticism, just pure honest truth delivered like a vow before God. "I see a woman who has survived grief and emerged stronger, who builds beauty with her hands, who moves through this world with grace that has nothing to do with the number of years she has lived." The silence that followed was absolute, sacred, as if the very building held its breath waiting for Eleanor's response. Stay with me, friends, and comment your city below. I'm sharing this story from Denver, Colorado. Subscribe to my channel and let's see how far our story travels today. Eleanor fled the Silver Spur like a woman pursued by demons, her skirts gathered in trembling fists as she half ran down Main Street toward the sanctuary of her small seamstress shop. The mortification burned through her chest like swallowed fire, making each breath a deliberate effort as she fumbled with the key to her door, finally stumbling inside the cramped space that served as both her livelihood and her prison. Bolts of fabric lined the walls in careful organization, calicos and muslins and one precious length of green velvet she had been saving for a special commission that would likely never come, while 3 half-finished dresses hung on forms like headless ghosts waiting for completion. The shop smelled of starch and lavender sachet, familiar scents that usually brought comfort, but today only emphasized how small her world had become in the 3 years since Henry had died. She had been 18 when she married Henry Hayes, barely more than a child herself, and he had been a good man, a kind man, 22 years her senior and patient with her youth and ignorance. For 15 years she had tried to give him children, had endured the monthly disappointment, the pitying looks from other women, the slow realization that her body was somehow broken in a way that mattered more than any other failing could. Henry had never blamed her, had told her they were enough for each other, but she'd seen the sadness in his eyes when he watched other men with their sons, had felt herself shrinking under the weight of her inadequacy. When the pneumonia took him 3 winters past, she had nursed him for 2 weeks while his lungs filled with fluid and his fever burned away the man she had known, leaving a stranger who died calling for his mother in a voice thin as paper. The town had been kind at first, bringing casseroles and condolences, but kindness has a short shelf life and soon she was just another widow, past her prime at 32, consigned to a life of mending other people's clothes and sleeping alone in a narrow bed that had once held two. She worked herself to exhaustion because exhaustion was easier than loneliness, taking on every commission no matter how tedious, staying up until her eyes burned and her fingers bled from needle pricks. Now she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above her wash basin and forced herself to really look, at what James Crawford claimed to see as beautiful. The face staring back was angular and tired, fine lines radiating from the corners of her eyes like cracks in porcelain, silver threads visible in the brown hair she kept so severely pinned. Her hands were rough from work, her figure thin from forgetting to eat, her dress a practical grey that did nothing to soften the harsh reality of woman who had been used up by life and left with nothing but thread and needles and the crushing knowledge that she was exactly what the town said she was, past her prime, past hope, past everything except the slow march toward an old age she would face utterly alone. The evening shadows were stretching long across Main Street when Eleanor heard the knock on her shop door, gentle but insistent, and she knew without looking that it would be James Crawford standing on her doorstep with some foolish gesture that would make this whole impossible situation worse. She had spent the past 2 hours attempting to work on Mrs. Henderson's day dress, but had accomplished nothing except pricking her finger 3 times and having to unpick an entire seam, her hands shaking too badly to manage the delicate work that usually brought her such calm. The knock came again, and she rose with the heavy reluctance of a condemned woman walking to the gallows, opening the door just wide enough to see him standing there in the purple twilight with a bouquet of wild asters clutched in one work-roughened hand. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, and his voice was steady and sure despite the rejection he had endured just hours before. "I meant every word I said in that saloon. Age is just a number on a calendar. What I see when I look at you is a woman of grace, strength and kindness. Someone who has weathered storms that would have broken lesser souls." Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest at the earnestness in his young face, at the way he stood there holding those purple flowers like they were precious jewels, and she wanted to believe him with a desperation that terrified her. "You do not know what you are asking," she said, trying to keep her voice firm even as it threatened to break. "You should want a young girl who can give you children, who can give you a full life instead of the empty years I have left. You deserve someone who can grow old with you, instead of ahead of you, someone whose best years are not already behind her." She could see curtains twitching in windows up and down the street, could feel the weight of watching eyes even in the gathering darkness, knew that tomorrow this scene would be dissected and discussed in every parlour and storefront in Billings. James took a step closer and she could smell the honest scent of horses and leather and soap on him, could see the absolute conviction in his eyes that made her want to weep. "I do not want a girl, Mrs. Hayes," he said quietly. "I want a woman who knows herself, who has survived loss and grief and emerged stronger on the other side. I want someone who understands that life is hard and precious and not to be wasted on pretending or playing games. That is you. That is what I see when I look at you, and no amount of years or town gossip or well-meaning advice is going to change my mind." Eleanor felt the tears coming and hated herself for the weakness, for wanting so desperately to believe that this impossible thing could somehow be real. She took the flowers from his hand because refusing them would have been too cruel, held them against her chest like a shield, and then gently closed the door between them, before she could do something truly foolish like invite him inside, or worse, tell him that she had been half in love with him since the first morning he had appeared at her shop with a torn shirt and a smile that made her forget for just a moment how old and used up she was. The door clicked shut and she stood there in the darkness listening to his footsteps retreat down the wooden walkway, and then she sank to the floor, still clutching those purple asters, and cried like she had not cried since the night Henry died. Eleanor needed flour and thread, simple necessities that could not be postponed, so she steeled herself the next morning and walked to Morrison's general store, knowing full well what awaited her there. Saturday mornings were always crowded, every farm wife and town matron doing their weekly shopping, and the whispers started the moment she stepped through the door, a susurrus of feminine voices that cut off abruptly only to resume at a lower volume the instant she passed. She kept her eyes forward and her spine straight, moving toward the thread display with as much dignity as she could muster, but she had only examined 2 spools when Beatrice Thompson materialized beside her, like a well-dressed, avenging angel. Mrs. Thompson was the banker's wife, 43 years old with iron-grey hair and a sense of moral superiority that she wore like armour, and her voice when she spoke carried clearly through the suddenly silent store. "It is unseemly, Eleanor," she announced, her tone dripping with false concern that fooled absolutely no one. "That boy is young enough to be your xia. You are taking advantage of his youth and his obvious infatuation. A decent woman would send him away for his own good instead of encouraging this spectacle." Eleanor felt the heat rise in her cheeks, felt every eye in the store turn toward her like sunflowers tracking the sun, and she opened her mouth to defend herself only to find that no words would come. She had not encouraged James, had in fact done everything possible to discourage him, but the truth had no currency in a court of public opinion that had already rendered its verdict. "I have done nothing improper," she managed finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Thompson made a dismissive sound, and several other women nodded in agreement, their faces ranging from pitying to disgusted. "You may tell yourself that, dear. But the entire town watched you receive his attentions for 2 weeks without putting a stop to it. A woman of your age should know better than to allow a boy barely out of short pants to make a fool of himself over you. It reflects poorly on your character and your judgment." Eleanor wanted to scream that she had tried to discourage him, that she had refused his flowers and his walks and his attempts at conversation, until finally his persistent kindness had worn down her defences enough that she had allowed herself to enjoy his company. But she could see from the set faces around her that explanation would be worse than useless. One by one, the women who had been her customers approached to quietly inform her that they would no longer require her services, that Mrs. Thompson had recommended a new seamstress from Denver who would be arriving next week, someone more appropriate for their needs. By the time Eleanor left the store with her small purchases clutched in nerveless hands, she had lost 4 clients representing nearly half her monthly income, and the looks that followed her out the door made it clear that she was no longer simply the pitied widow but something far worse in their eyes, a predatory older woman taking advantage of an innocent young man's misguided affections. James Crawford sat at the rough pine table in the bunkhouse of the Double R Ranch that evening, pretending to pay attention to the card game while his mind was miles away on a certain doorstep where purple asters had been accepted and a door had been gently closed. The bunkhouse smelled of tobacco smoke and boot leather, and the stew Tommy Harper had burned for supper, familiar scents that usually brought comfort, but tonight only emphasized how alone a man could be, even when surrounded by others. Tommy, barely 19 and still soft-faced despite a year of ranch work, threw down his cards with disgust and turned to James with the bluntness of youth. "You know the whole town thinks you are touched in the head, right? Proposing to a woman old enough to be your mother, getting yourself humiliated in front of half of Billings." Richard Redmond, the ranch owner, looked up from his own cards with the gruff expression that hid a fundamentally fair heart, waiting to see how his best hand would respond to the needling. James set down his own cards with deliberate care and met Tommy's eyes with the same steady gaze that had faced down spooked horses and wounded cattle, and the countless small cruelties of a world that had taken everything from him before he was old enough to fight back. "Then the whole town is blind," he said quietly. "Eleanor Hayes is worth 10 of these simpering girls their mothers keep parading around hoping to catch a husband. She has lived and survived and knows what matters in this world." Richard grunted what might have been approval, and Tommy shook his head in bewilderment, but James did not expect them to understand, because understanding required knowing what it meant to lose everything and keep walking anyway. He had been 14 when the cholera swept through their small Ohio town, taking his mother first and his father 3 days later, leaving him alone in a world that had no use for orphaned boys with no money and no prospects. His mother had been 38 when she died, and his father 55, a 17-year gap that the town had whispered about when they married, but which had resulted in 20 years of partnership so solid that his father had simply laid down and died, rather than face a world without her. James had learned young that age was just a number on a calendar, that what mattered was the quality of the love between two people, not the arithmetic of their birth years. He had worked his way west doing any job that would feed him and let him save a few coins, washing dishes and mucking stables and breaking horses for men who paid him less than he was worth, and every penny he did not spend on bare necessities went into the leather pouch he kept hidden in his bedroll. $200 he had saved toward the dream of his own small ranch, 40 acres where he could raise horses and build something that belonged to him and him alone. But lately that dream had shifted to include a woman with tired eyes and capable hands who moved through the world with a grace born of surviving things that would have broken lesser souls. The loneliness that James carried was a mirror of Eleanor's own, the knowledge that you could be surrounded by people and still feel utterly alone, and he recognized in her the same quiet desperation he saw in his own reflection every morning. Within a week of the confrontation at Morrison's general store, Beatrice Thompson had orchestrated a scheme so thoroughly devastating that Eleanor could only marvel at the efficiency of feminine cruelty when properly motivated. A new seamstress arrived in Billings on the Wednesday stage, a young woman named Lily Chen, who had learned her trade in San Francisco and came with recommendations that Mrs. Thompson personally vouched for to anyone who would listen. Lily was 24 years old, with smooth hands and bright eyes and the kind of eager energy that made Eleanor feel ancient by comparison, and she set up shop in the storefront that had previously housed the barber before he moved to larger quarters. The location was prime, right on Main Street with the large windows that let in abundant light, and Mrs. Thompson personally escorted every one of Eleanor's former clients to meet this promising young talent. Eleanor watched from her cramped shop as her livelihood evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun, each lost commission, another nail in the coffin of her independence. Mrs. Henderson cancelled her order with apologies that sounded sincere but meant nothing. Mrs. Williams claimed that she had decided to make her own dresses this season. Mrs. Patterson simply sent her daughter with a terse note saying her services were no longer required. By Friday, Eleanor had exactly 2 clients remaining, both elderly widows who apparently felt enough kinship with another woman past her prime to resist the social pressure. But 2 clients could not sustain a business or pay rent on even her modest quarters. She sat in her empty shop surrounded by fabric and half-finished work and felt the desperation rising in her throat like bile. The crushing realization that she was being systematically driven out of town for the crime of being wanted by a man 12 years her junior. She had not accepted his proposal, had in fact refused him publicly and privately, had done everything a proper woman should do to discourage unsuitable attention, and yet here she was facing financial ruin, because the good women of Billings had decided she needed to be punished for daring to be seen as desirable, when she should have had the decency to fade into invisible spinsterhood. Across the street, Lily Chen's shop bustled with activity, women coming and going with dress forms and fabric samples, and Eleanor felt no animosity toward the girl who was simply trying to make her own way in the world. This was not Lily's doing, but rather the machinations of women who could not bear to see one of their own step outside the narrow boundaries of acceptable behaviour, who enforced the unspoken rules with the ruthless efficiency of generals commanding armies. Eleanor had committed no sin except existing in a body that had accumulated 35 years of life, but that was sin enough in a world that measured a woman's worth by her youth and her ability to produce children. She stared at her empty appointment book and felt the walls closing in, knowing that without income she would lose her shop within a month, and then where would she go? What would she do? How would she survive in a world that had no use for women like her? The Sunday church social was held under the cottonwood trees in the churchyard, long tables laden with fried chicken and cornbread and apple pies baked by women competing to display their domestic prowess, and the entire population of Billings seemed to have turned out for the event on this sunny September afternoon. Eleanor had considered staying home, but her stubborn pride would not allow her to hide as if she had done something shameful. So she came and positioned herself at the edge of the gathering, near the fence where she could observe without being observed, or so she thought until James Crawford strode directly to the centre of the yard where Beatrice Thompson was holding court like a queen among her subjects. The conversation died in rippling circles outward from where James stood, his hat in his hands but his spine straight as an iron rod, and Eleanor felt her heart begin to pound with dread at what was about to unfold. "Mrs. Thompson," James said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent yard, "you speak often of Christian charity and proper behaviour, but I see precious little charity in the way you have treated Mrs. Hayes. She has done nothing wrong except exist while being admired. Is that her crime? That a man finds her worthy of respect and affection?" Mrs. Thompson's face flushed an ugly red, and she drew herself up with the outraged dignity of someone unaccustomed to being challenged. "Young man, you are making a spectacle of yourself and dragging a respectable widow's name through the mud with your inappropriate attentions." James shook his head and turned to address the entire gathering, every man, woman and child who had stopped eating to watch this drama unfold. "I am 23 years old, of sound mind and independent means, and I love Eleanor Hayes. I love her intelligence, her strength, her kindness, her grace under circumstances that would have broken lesser people. I love the way she sees the world and the way she moves through it with dignity, despite those who would tear her down for daring to be more than they expect. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly, instead of whispering behind her back and driving away her livelihood like cowards." The silence that followed was absolute and electric. broken only by the rustling of cottonwood leaves overhead and the distant lowing of cattle in the fields beyond town. Eleanor stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, horrified and moved in equal measure, wanting to sink into the earth and simultaneously wanting to run to him and damn the consequences. She could see the reactions rippling through the gathering like wind across wheat. Some of the men nodding with what looked like grudging respect for a young buck willing to stand up for what he believed in, while most of the women looked scandalized that he would dare challenge Mrs. Thompson's authority so publicly. Richard Redmond caught Eleanor's eye from across the yard and gave her the slightest nod of approval, and she realized with a start that she had more allies than she knew, quiet ones who had not spoken up but who had been watching this persecution with growing disapproval. Eleanor hired a wagon from the livery that evening and drove herself the 5 miles to the Double R Ranch, a journey so scandalous for an unmarried woman that she half expected lightning to strike her down before she arrived. But desperation and gratitude had overridden propriety somewhere between James's public declaration and the setting of the sun. She found him in the barn as she had hoped, brushing down a bay mare by lamplight. And he looked up at her arrival with such unguarded joy that she nearly turned and fled before she could say what needed to be said. "You will ruin your reputation for nothing," she said without preamble, her voice echoing in the hay-scented dimness where horses nickered softly in their stalls. "You stood up for me today and it was the most gallant thing anyone has ever done, but you need to understand what you are fighting for, what you think you want from me." James set down the brush and moved toward her with the same steady deliberateness he brought to everything, and she held up a hand to stop him, because if he touched her now, she would lose her courage entirely. "I cannot give you children, James. I tried for 15 years with Henry. Every month for 15 years I hoped and prayed and failed, and eventually we had to accept that my body is broken in that fundamental way. I am barren." The word felt like poison on her tongue, the deepest shame she carried, the failure that defined her worth in the eyes of every woman who had ever pitied her. The admission hung in the air between them like smoke, and she waited for him to recoil, to finally understand why she was so completely unsuitable. But instead he stepped closer and his eyes held nothing but tenderness. "I do not want children," he said quietly. "I want you. I want a partner, a companion, someone to build a life with. I want to come home to someone who understands that the world is hard and beautiful and worth fighting for. Children are a blessing when they come, but they are not the measure of a marriage or a life." Eleanor felt something crack and reform inside her chest, some piece of herself she thought had died with Henry suddenly stirring back to painful life. She took a shaking breath and made herself voice the proposal that had been forming since she watched him defend her to the entire town. 6 months, she said. "Give me 6 months of proper courtship. I will allow you to call on me, to escort me to church and town events, to court me as publicly as you wish. If at the end of 6 months you still want this, if you have not realized what everyone else already knows, then I will give you my answer. But I will not let you sacrifice yourself on the altar of youthful infatuation without giving you time to see reason." James studied her face in the lamplight, and she could see him weighing her words, understanding that this was both a concession and a test. 6 months to prove to you that I know my own mind," he said finally. 6 months to show you that what I feel is not infatuation but recognition of something real and lasting." She nodded and held out her hand to shake on it like men sealing a business arrangement, and when his calloused palm met hers she felt the future shift beneath her feet like a horse changing direction beneath an inexperienced rider. The courtship that followed was conducted with a propriety that would have satisfied even the most exacting chaperone. James calling at Eleanor's shop each Sunday afternoon for walks along the creek that ran through the cottonwoods outside town, bringing her lunch on Wednesdays wrapped in clean cloth and tied with string, escorting her to church services and town events with his hand carefully positioned at her elbow, in a gesture that was respectful rather than possessive. The age difference between them was impossible to ignore, visible in the way his face was unlined and hopeful while hers carried the map of 35 years of living, in this way he moved with the easy energy of youth while she carried herself with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned that the world demanded caution from women who had already lost everything once. The comments followed them everywhere like persistent flies, whispered observations about robbing cradles and foolish boys and women who should know better. But gradually something began to shift in the spaces between the hostility. One Sunday afternoon by the creek, James picked up a flat stone and showed Eleanor how to skip it across the water, positioning her arm and demonstrating the wrist flick required to make it dance across the surface. And when her stone actually bounced 3 times, she laughed, with such surprised delight that he stopped breathing for a moment at the sound of it. She could not remember the last time she had laughed like that, unguarded and genuine, the sound startling birds from the nearby trees and bringing colour to her cheeks that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with simple joy. Other afternoons she would mend his shirts, while he sat in her shop reading aloud from books she had not touched since Henry died, his voice stumbling occasionally over unfamiliar words but pressing on with determination, and she found herself looking forward to these quiet hours more than she wanted to admit. The tentative happiness that grew between them was fragile as new ice, easily shattered by a wrong word or harsh look, but it grew nonetheless, fed by small kindnesses and patient attention, and the gradual lowering of walls both had built to protect hearts that had already been broken by loss. The town's reaction remained largely hostile, women turning their backs when Eleanor entered shops and men making crude jokes when James passed, but here and there defenders began to emerge from unexpected quarters. Old Samuel Wright, who had buried 3 wives, spoke up at the barber shop to say that love was rare enough without people trying to dictate its proper form. Spinster Margaret Collins, who had never married and was approaching 50 herself, began sitting with Eleanor at church socials, a silent statement of solidarity that meant more than words could convey. The battle was far from won, but the lines were no longer quite so clearly drawn, and Eleanor allowed herself to hope that perhaps 6 months might not be enough time to discourage James Crawford after all. Victor Thompson had been watching Eleanor Hayes with growing fury ever since that disgraceful scene in the saloon when the Crawford boy had made his ridiculous proposal, and each subsequent sighting of them together walking by the creek or sitting together at church socials added fuel to a rage that had been smouldering for 3 years. Victor was 32 years old, the only son of Beatrice and the late Benjamin Thompson who had built the bank. From nothing and left it to his son, along with a sense of entitlement that sat on Victor's shoulders like an ill-fitting coat. He had proposed to Eleanor twice in the year following Henry Hayes's death, confident that a widow of her age and limited means would be grateful for the security he offered, and her gentle refusals had stung his pride in ways he could not articulate even to himself. The second rejection had been less gentle, her patience clearly worn thin by his persistence, and he had retreated to nurse his wounded ego, while telling himself that she simply needed more time to recognize the wisdom of his offer. Now she was allowing a ranch hand barely out of boyhood to court her publicly, while continuing to refuse a man of Victor's standing and means, and the injustice of it consumed him like a slow-burning fire. He sat in his office at the bank surrounded by dark wood panelling and leather-bound ledgers, his father's stern portrait glaring down from the wall as if in judgment of a son who could not even secure the affections of a penniless widow. The mortgage documents for Eleanor's shop lay on his desk where he had pulled them from the files. $300 due in 3 months, a sum that would be challenging for her to meet even if she still had clients instead of the 2 elderly widows who formed her entire remaining customer base. Victor studied the papers with the cold calculation he brought to all financial matters and made his decision with the certainty of a man who believed the world owed him compensation for every slight. That afternoon he visited Eleanor's shop, entering without knocking, and finding her bent over her sewing table working on a dress for Mrs. Crawford, the irony of which was not lost on him. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice carrying the false pleasantness that barely concealed his anger, "I thought I should personally remind you that your mortgage payment comes due in 3 months. $300 is a substantial sum, and given your recent difficulties retaining clients, I wanted to ensure you were aware that it would be most unfortunate if certain financial obligations came due early due to breach of contract." Eleanor looked up with fear blooming in her eyes, and Victor felt a surge of satisfaction at finally having leverage over this woman who had rejected him in favour of a boy who could offer her nothing but calloused hands and empty dreams. "The shop lease requires that you maintain a respectable business," he continued, "and recent events have called that respectability into question. I would hate to invoke that clause, but the bank has its standards to maintain." The October afternoon was golden as honey when James borrowed a wagon and drove Eleanor to a spot along the Yellowstone River, where the aspens had turned to brilliant yellow and the water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. He had packed a simple lunch of bread and cheese and apples, and they sat on a blanket spread over the grass while the river sang its endless song and the autumn sun warmed their faces with the last sweet heat before winter's arrival. "I want to show you something," James said, pulling a worn piece of paper from his pocket and unfolding it with the careful reverence of a man handling something precious. It was a survey map of 40 acres located 10 miles north of Billings, good grazing land with a creek running through it and a stand of pine trees that would provide timber for building. "I have been saving for 5 years, he told her, his voice quiet but steady. $200 toward the down payment, and I need another $200 before next summer when the current owner is ready to sell. I want to build something, Eleanor. Not for just me anymore, but for us. A small ranch where we could raise horses, maybe some cattle, build a house that is ours instead of borrowed or rented." The vulnerability in his voice made her chest ache with tenderness and fear in equal measure, and she found herself sharing something she had told no one since Henry died. "I wanted to open a dress shop in Helena once," she admitted, the words coming haltingly as if pulled from some deep hidden place. Not just mending and alterations, but designing fine gowns, creating beautiful things instead of simply repairing what others had worn out. Henry and I talked about it before he got sick, but then there was the medical bills and the funeral costs, and the dream just seemed foolish for a woman my age. James reached across the blanket and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "It is not foolish," he said firmly. "Dreams do not have expiration dates, Eleanor. You could still do that. Open a shop in Helena or anywhere else you wanted. I would help you build it just like you would help me build the ranch. We could build our dreams together instead of abandoning them separately." The intimacy of the moment was almost unbearable, the sharing of abandoned hopes more naked than any physical touch could be, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the simple generosity of his vision. When he leaned toward her, she met him halfway, and their first kiss was gentle and tentative and absolutely perfect, tasting of apples and autumn sunshine and possibility. His lips were soft against hers, asking rather than demanding, and she felt something long frozen inside her begin to thaw like spring ice breaking up on the river. They pulled apart after a moment that lasted both seconds and eternity, and James rested his forehead against hers while they both struggled to breathe normally. "I love you," he whispered, and Eleanor closed her eyes against the impossible beauty of hearing those words spoken with such absolute conviction by someone who had every reason to choose differently. Martha Brennan arrived at Eleanor's shop on a Tuesday morning in mid-October, driving her own wagon with the casual competence of a woman who had spent 30 years running a ranch and saw no reason to stop just because her husband had died. She was 58 years old with steel-grey hair worn in a practical bun and hands that showed the calluses of hard work, and she marched into the shop like a general taking possession of conquered territory. "I need my entire wardrobe remade," she announced without preamble. 6 day dresses, 2 Sunday dresses, a riding habit, and whatever else you think a woman my age needs to remain decent. I heard that fool Beatrice Thompson drove away your business because you dared to be courted by a younger man, and I will not stand for such nonsense in my town." Eleanor stared at her, momentarily speechless, and Martha settled herself in the chair by the window with the air of someone prepared to wait as long as necessary for comprehension to dawn. "Let them talk," Martha said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had stopped caring about other people's opinions decades ago. "I married a man 20 years younger than myself and had 30 years of happiness before he passed last spring. Thomas was 32 when we wed, and I was 52, and half the county said I was robbing the cradle and taking advantage of his youth. They said the same things about you they are saying now, that he would regret it, that I was being selfish, that age differences like ours were unnatural. But Thomas and I built a ranch and a life together, and when the fever took him, he died holding my hand and telling me he had never regretted a single day. Age is nothing but a number on a calendar, Eleanor. What matters is whether 2 people can build something real together." Eleanor felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely, overwhelmed by this unexpected support from a woman she barely knew. Martha spent the next hour being measured and selecting fabrics, ordering enough work to keep Eleanor busy for months and paying half in advance without being asked. The ranch house where Martha took Eleanor for tea afterward was comfortable and worn, full of the kind of lived-in warmth that comes from years of accumulated memories, and over cups of strong coffee Martha shared stories of her marriage that made Eleanor laugh and cry in equal measure. But as the afternoon waned, Martha's expression grew serious and she leaned forward with the intensity of someone delivering a warning that could not be ignored. "Victor Thompson is trouble," she said bluntly. "I have known that boy since he was in short pants, and he has always been the type to take what he thinks he deserves regardless of who gets hurt in the process. He wanted you for himself, and seeing you happy with James Crawford will make him dangerous. Watch yourself, Eleanor, and watch that young man of yours. Men like Victor do not accept defeat gracefully." The annual harvest dance was the social event of the season in Billings, held at the Grange Hall on the last Saturday of October, and when James asked Eleanor to attend as his official companion, she felt terror and excitement war inside her chest. Until she thought she might burst from the pressure of both emotions at once, she spent a week making herself a new dress from the precious green velvet she had been hoarding, cutting and stitching with a care she had not brought to her own clothes in years. And when she finally stood before her small mirror on the evening of the dance, she barely recognized the woman looking back at her. The green brought out the colour in her eyes, and the cut flattered her slim figure in ways her practical grey dresses never had. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to think the word beautiful, without immediately dismissing it as foolish vanity. The Grange Hall had been transformed with cornstalks bundled at the corners, and pumpkins arranged along the walls, lanterns hanging from the rafters casting warm golden light over the crowd of farmers and ranchers and townspeople who had come to celebrate another successful harvest. James arrived to collect her in his Sunday suit with his hair slicked back and his eyes wide with admiration when he saw her in the green velvet, and the way he looked at her made her feel young and desired and terrifyingly alive. They entered the hall together, and the whispers started immediately like wind through dry grass, but James kept his hand at her waist and his attention focused entirely on her as if the rest of the world had simply ceased to exist. When the fiddles started and he led her onto the floor for a waltz, she moved into his arms with a sense of rightness that transcended all the practical objections her mind tried to raise. They danced 3 dances together while the crowd watched and whispered, and Eleanor found herself laughing at something James said, her head thrown back in genuine joy, and for those precious minutes she forgot to be afraid or ashamed or worried about what tomorrow might bring. The music was sweet and the lantern light was warm, and James held her like she was something precious, and she felt herself belonging in a way she had not belonged since Henry died. Then Victor Thompson appeared at James's shoulder, his face flushed with drink and anger, and without asking permission, he cut in with a grip on Eleanor's waist that was too tight to be gentlemanly. James stepped back reluctantly at the social convention that dictated a man must allow others to dance with his partner, but his eyes remained fixed on them with growing concern. Victor pulled Eleanor close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, and his fingers dug into her waist with bruising force as he moved her stiffly across the floor. "You are making a fool of yourself with that boy," he hissed into her ear, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "A woman your age should have more dignity than to parade around like some lovesick girl, and when he tires of this game you will have nothing left, no reputation and no prospects, and certainly no help from those who might have assisted you before you threw their regard back in their face." Victor Thompson appeared at Eleanor's shop 3 days after the harvest dance, arriving in the middle of a grey November morning, with a leather portfolio tucked under his arm and an expression of false sympathy that made her skin crawl with instinctive dread. He settled himself in her shop without invitation, spreading papers across her work table with the casual authority of a man who knew he held all the power in the room, and when he finally looked up at her, his eyes were cold despite the solicitous tone of his voice. "I am afraid I have unfortunate news, Mrs. Hayes," he said, tapping one of the documents with a manicured finger that had never known a day of honest labour. "The bank has reviewed your mortgage agreement, and we have determined that the moral turpitude clause has been triggered by your recent behaviour. Your very public association with that ranch hand has damaged your business reputation to the point where we can no longer consider this a viable commercial property. Therefore, I am calling in the full amount of your mortgage effective immediately. You have 30 days to pay $300 or vacate the premises." Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her feet as the words registered. 30 days to find an amount of money that might as well have been $3,000 for all the chance she had of acquiring it. Her remaining 2 clients brought in perhaps $20 a month between them. She had $15 in savings, and there was no conceivable way to bridge the gap between what she had and what Victor was demanding. "Of course," he continued, leaning back in his chair with the satisfaction of a cat that had cornered a mouse, "I am not without compassion for your situation. I could forgive the debt entirely, wipe it clean from the books, if you would reconsider my previous proposal of marriage. You would have security, Eleanor, a position in society, everything a woman your age should want instead of this foolish infatuation with a boy who cannot possibly provide for you." The rage that rose in Eleanor's chest was so fierce it momentarily overwhelmed the fear, and she drew herself up to her full height and met his eyes with all the dignity she could muster. "I would rather be penniless," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I would rather sleep in the street than bind myself to a man who uses his power to coerce women into accepting his attentions. You are despicable, Victor Thompson, and I will find a way to pay this debt without selling myself to you." Victor's face darkened with anger, and he gathered his papers with sharp movements that betrayed the fury beneath his civilized veneer. "30 days, Mrs. Hayes," he said as he moved toward the door. "After that, everything in this shop becomes property of the bank, and you will leave Billings with nothing but the clothes on your back and the reputation of a woman who chose poorly." Eleanor waited until he was gone before she allowed herself to sink into the chair, her mind racing through impossible calculations and desperate schemes. But she did not consider for even a moment telling James about this new threat, because he would offer her his savings, and she would not allow him to sacrifice his dream of the ranch to rescue her from consequences that were hers alone to bear. James had noticed Eleanor's distraction over the past week, the way her hands trembled when she poured coffee, and the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. But it was not until he arrived for their usual Wednesday evening together, and found her crying over ledgers spread across her small dining table, that he finally understood something was desperately wrong. She tried to hide the tears when she heard him knock, wiping her face with shaking hands and attempting a smile that fooled no one. But James pushed past the social niceties and knelt beside her chair, with his heart hammering against his ribs. "What has happened?" he demanded, and the combination of fear and fury in his voice finally broke through her defences enough that the whole sordid story came tumbling out in broken sentences, punctuated by tears she could no longer contain. Victor Thompson had called in her mortgage early, using some moral clause as justification. She had 30 days to pay $300 she did not have. He had offered to forgive the debt if she married him, and she had refused because she would rather lose everything than submit to that kind of extortion. James felt rage consume him like wildfire, pure and cleansing and absolutely murderous, and he was on his feet before he knew he had moved, with his hands clenched into fists and his voice coming out in a growl that would have frightened her if she had not known him well enough to recognize it as protective rather than threatening. "I will kill him," James said, meaning every word with a sincerity that was almost frightening. "I will walk into that bank tomorrow and beat him until he cannot remember his own name." Eleanor grabbed his arm with surprising strength and pulled him back down beside him with the desperation of a woman who knew that violence would only make everything worse. "You will do no such thing," she said firmly, despite the tears still streaming down her face. "Violence solves nothing except to give men like Victor exactly the excuse they need to destroy you completely." James forced himself to breathe, to think past the red haze of fury, and then he remembered his savings and felt hope surge through him like dawn breaking. "Take my money," he said, pulling her hands into his and holding them tight enough that she could feel his certainty. "I have $200 saved. Take it and I will find a way to earn the rest before the 30 days are up. My dream of the ranch can wait." Eleanor pulled her hands free and stood up, putting distance between them as if proximity made her resolve weaker. "I will not let you sacrifice your future for past mistakes," she said, her voice breaking on the words. "That money represents 5 years of your life, 5 years of saving every penny and denying yourself everything except bare necessities. I will not take that from you for a shop that may be doomed anyway." The argument that followed was intense and desperate, both of them wanting to help and unable to accept help, frustrated love making them say things they did not mean and then immediately apologize. And it ended with James pulling her into his arms and kissing her with a passion that spoke of desperation and need, an absolute refusal to let her face this alone. Eleanor kissed him back with equal fervour, her hands fisting in his shirt as if she could anchor herself to him. But when his hands moved to the buttons of her dress, she pulled away with a gasp, and they stood there breathing hard and staring at each other across a distance of 3 feet that felt like miles. Martha Brennan had ways of learning things that happened in Billings, and when word of Victor Thompson's ultimatum reached her ears through the network of ranch wives and town gossips who passed information like currency, she wasted no time in calling a secret meeting at her ranch house under the guise of organizing a sewing circle. The women who gathered in her comfortable parlour on a Thursday afternoon represented an unlikely coalition united by shared experiences of being underestimated and undervalued by men who thought their money and position gave them the right to control women's lives. Rose Chen arrived first, the mother of Lily, who had unknowingly been used as a weapon against Eleanor, and her face carried the weight of guilt for her daughter's unwitting role in this persecution. Widow Sarah McGregor came next, a woman of 50 who had buried 2 husbands and knew exactly what it meant to be considered past one's prime, followed by 3 other women whose names might not have carried weight in town, but whose combined determination could move mountains if properly directed. Martha served tea and cakes in her parlour, where afternoon light streamed through lace curtains, and then she laid out the situation with the bluntness of a woman who had no patience for delicate euphemisms. Eleanor Hayes needed $300 in 30 days, or Victor Thompson would take everything she'd worked for, and more than that, he would drive her out of Billings as an example to any other woman who dared to step outside the narrow boundaries of acceptable behaviour. The silence that followed was heavy with shared understanding, each woman remembering times when men had used financial power as a leash to keep them obedient and grateful. Then Rose Chen spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "My Lily felt terrible taking Eleanor's business," she said. "She did not know she was being used as punishment for a woman's crime of being courted. This makes it right." What followed was a conspiracy wrapped in the respectable clothing of a sewing circle, each woman commissioning work from Eleanor that ranged from genuinely needed to completely invented, but all paid for in advance. Martha ordered enough dresses to clothe her for 3 years. Rose commissioned a wedding trousseau for Lily, who was not even engaged. Sarah requested table linens and bed linens and curtains that her house did not actually need. And the others followed suit with projects both practical and fantastical. Within a week they had generated $150 worth of work, all paid up front, and Eleanor, who had been told only that word of her skill had spread and orders were coming in, did not question this sudden reversal of fortune too closely, because desperation made people willing to believe in small miracles. The women met again the following week to count their success and plan their next moves, and Martha looked around her parlour at these unlikely revolutionaries and felt a fierce pride in what female solidarity could accomplish when women stopped competing for male approval and started supporting each other instead. James sold his horse on a cold November morning without telling anyone except the buyer, a rancher from the next county over who paid $75 for the gelding that James had raised from a colt and trained with his own hands over the past 3 years. The horse was his most precious possession. Besides his savings, the animal he had planned to use as foundation stock for his breeding program, but when he counted out the money alongside his $200 in savings and realized he had enough to save Eleanor from Victor Thompson's cruelty, the choice was not difficult at all. He gave the total of $275 to Martha Brennan, with instructions to present it to Eleanor anonymously, as if it had come from the sewing circle fundraising efforts, and Martha looked at him with such fierce approval that he felt his face heat with embarrassment at being seen through so completely. Eleanor did not discover the truth until 3 days later, when she happened to be making a delivery to Morrison's General Store and saw James walking along the road toward the Double R Ranch in the early morning light with his saddle slung over his shoulder, like a man who no longer had a horse to carry it for him. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, and she dropped her parcel on the store counter and ran out into the street without her shawl or bonnet, calling his name as she hurried after him on the dusty road. James stopped when he heard her voice, but did not turn around, and when she caught up to him breathless and already crying, she grabbed his arm and spun him to face her with strength born of desperation and dawning understanding. "You sold your horse," she said, the words coming out between gasps for air. "The money Martha gave me. It was not all from the sewing circle. It was from you. You sold the horse you have been training for 3 years to raise my share of the mortgage payment." James met her eyes steadily, and she saw no regret in them, only the calm certainty of a man who had made his choice and would not be swayed from it. "You are my future, Eleanor," he said simply. "The land can wait, but you cannot, and I will not stand by and let that bastard drive you out of town, because I was too proud or too foolish to help when I had the means." She tried to give the money back, pressing it into his hands while tears streamed down her face, but he closed her fingers around the bills and held her hands in his until she stopped struggling. "I am going to pay you back every cent," she said fiercely. "Every single cent if it takes me years." And James smiled and pulled her into his arms right there on the public road where anyone could see. "I know you will," he said against her hair. And Eleanor felt the last of her walls crumble into dust as she accepted not just his sacrifice, but the overwhelming love that had motivated it. Eleanor walked into Thompson Bank on the morning of the 30th day with $275 counted and recounted so many times the bills were soft as cloth, her heart hammering with the desperate hope that Victor might accept partial payment and grant her a few more weeks to raise the final $25 she needed. The bank was busy with morning customers conducting their weekly business, farmers depositing earnings and merchants paying accounts, and their conversations died to whispers when Eleanor approached Victor's desk with her envelope of money clutched in trembling hands. "Mr. Thompson," she said, keeping her voice as steady as possible, "I have $275 toward my mortgage payment, and I am requesting a brief extension to raise the final $25. Victor looked up from his ledgers with cold eyes and something like satisfaction playing around his mouth, and he made a show of examining the money she laid on his desk before pushing it back toward her, with one finger as if it were contaminated. "Full amount or foreclosure, Mrs. Hayes," he said loudly enough that every customer in the bank could hear. "Those were the terms, and I will not adjust them now simply because you have discovered that your poor choices have consequences." Eleanor felt humiliation and desperation warring in her chest, felt the eyes of the entire town upon her and the persons of the bank customers who had stopped pretending not to watch, and she was opening her mouth to beg when the bank door slammed open with enough force to rattle the windows. James Crawford strode across the floor with fury in every line of his body, and he threw a small leather pouch onto Victor's desk with enough force that coins scattered across the polished surface. "Here is your blood money, Thompson," James said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet rage that was far more dangerous than shouting. $25 borrowed from my employer against next month's wages, which means Eleanor Hayes has now paid her debt in full, and you have no further claim on her property or her life." Victor's face went from pale to flushed in the space of a heartbeat, and he swept the coins back into a pile with shaking hands while other customers began to murmur their approval of this dramatic rescue. "This is not over," Victor said, but his voice lacked conviction because everyone in the bank could see that he had lost this particular battle. James helped Eleanor gather the payment into a neat stack and watched, with grim satisfaction, as Victor was forced to write out a receipt marking the mortgage paid in full, and when they turned to leave, James took Eleanor's hand in his and held it openly for the first time in public as they walked out of the bank together. The triumph Eleanor felt was sweeter than honey, but edged with fear because she knew Victor Thompson was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully, and his threat that this was not over echoed in her mind like a promise of future retribution that would come when they least expected it. The story of James selling his horse to save Eleanor's shop spread through Billings like wildfire through dry grass, carried by the bank customers who had witnessed the dramatic confrontation and embellished with each retelling until it took on the qualities of legend. By Sunday morning, everyone in town knew that the young ranch hand had sacrificed his most precious possession for love of a woman 12 years his senior. And more than that, they knew about the coalition of women who had organized to support Eleanor against Victor Thompson's vindictive scheme. The narrative was shifting in ways that even Beatrice Thompson could not control, whispers in the general store and conversations over fences gradually changing from scandalous older woman preying on innocent youth to romantic tale of true love overcoming obstacles and prejudice. More customers began returning to Eleanor's shop, some sheepishly admitting they had been wrong to abandon her, others simply placing orders without acknowledging they had ever stopped. And Eleanor found herself busy enough that she had to work late into the evenings to keep up with demand. The true turning point came during Sunday service when Pastor Williams, a widower of 65 who had buried his own wife after 40 years of marriage, chose to address the situation directly from his pulpit in front of the assembled congregation. He spoke of biblical love, of Ruth following Naomi, and of the Song of Solomon celebrating passion regardless of propriety, and then he looked directly at Eleanor and James sitting in their usual pew and said that love which asked nothing for itself but gave everything for another was the truest reflection of divine grace that mortals could achieve. He reminded his flock that Jesus himself had rebuked the Pharisees for caring more about the letter of the law than the spirit of compassion, and that those who would condemn two people for loving each other despite differences in age or station were missing the entire point of Christian charity. The sermon landed like a thunderclap in the small church, some people nodding in agreement while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one could ignore the moral authority of a man who had served their community faithfully for 30 years. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as validation and belonging washed over her in waves, and when James reached over to take her hand, she did not pull away even though they were in full view of everyone. The hope that bloomed in her chest was fragile but real, the sense that perhaps this impossible thing might actually be possible after all, that the town might eventually accept what she and James were building together. But even as public opinion shifted, Victor Thompson's faction remained implacably hostile, Beatrice and her closest allies refusing to acknowledge the sermon or the changing tide, their faces set in lines of disapproval that promised this battle was far from over. November brought early snow to Montana Territory, thick white flakes that transformed Billings into something clean and new, and James and Eleanor's courtship continued through the shortened days and lengthening nights with an intimacy that had grown so deep it sometimes frightened them both. They had become emotionally naked with each other, in ways that felt more vulnerable than any physical joining could be, sharing fears and dreams and the small daily observations that most people kept locked inside. But Eleanor insisted on maintaining physical propriety with a determination that was starting to feel like the last fragile wall between her and complete surrender. The snowy evenings found them in Eleanor's shop more often than not, James reading aloud from whatever book she selected while she sewed by lamplight, his voice stumbling occasionally over difficult passages, but growing more confident with practice. And the domestic intimacy of these hours felt like a preview of the marriage they were both beginning to want with an intensity that made rational thought difficult. One evening in late November, as wind howled outside and snow piled against the windows, James set down his book and asked the question that had been building between them for weeks. "Eleanor, will you marry me in the spring when the snow melts and the world starts new again?" She looked up from her sewing with her heart hammering against her ribs and all her fears rising like ghosts to haunt her. "What if you wake up in 10 years and resent me for the youth I took from you?" she said, voicing the terror that kept her awake at night. "What if you look at me when I am 45 and you are 33 and realize you have bound yourself to a woman who is aging while you are still in your prime? What if you want children and I still cannot give them to you? What if everything you think you want now becomes a burden you cannot escape?" James crossed the small shop and knelt beside her chair, taking the sewing from her hands and holding them in his, with the steady patience that had become as familiar to her as breathing. "What if we waste these years worrying about years that have not happened yet?" he said. "What if we refuse this gift we have been given because we are too afraid of an imagined future to live in the real present? I cannot promise you that everything will be perfect, Eleanor, but I can promise that I will choose you every day for as long as I draw breath. And that seems like a better foundation for marriage than youthful certainty that has never been tested by hardship." The sexual tension that had been building between them for months crackled in the small space like lightning before a storm, and Eleanor felt herself leaning toward him with a hunger that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with the deep human need to be known and wanted completely. They agreed that night to marry in April, when the aspens leafed out and the world turned green again, 6 months of courtship proving what both of them already knew with absolute certainty, that they belonged to each other in ways that transcended age and circumstance, and every rational objection anyone could raise. Victor Thompson spent the weeks following his defeat at the bank plotting revenge with the cold calculation of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted, and could not accept that pattern changing now. He went through his ledgers with meticulous care until he found what he was looking for, a loan Richard Redmond had taken out 3 years prior to expand his ranch during a drought year. $500 still outstanding with interest accruing monthly. Richard had been making his payments faithfully if slowly, but the loan agreement contained clauses that gave the bank discretion to call in the full amount under certain circumstances, and Victor intended to use that discretion like a weapon aimed directly at James Crawford's livelihood. He visited the Double R Ranch on a cold Monday in mid-December, and presented Richard with an ultimatum wrapped in the language of business necessity: either dismiss James Crawford immediately, or face foreclosure proceedings that would begin before the new year. Richard Redmond was a fair man and a good employer, but he was also a pragmatist who understood that fighting the bank was a battle he could not win, and so 2 days before Christmas he called James into his office with the kind of sick dread that comes from being forced to hurt someone who does not deserve it. "I am sorry, son," Richard said, unable to meet James's eyes as he explained that the bank had called in his loan and made James's dismissal a condition of extending the payment deadline. "Thompson has got me over a barrel and there is nothing I can do about it without losing everything my father built. You are the best hand I have ever had, the most honest and hard-working man on this ranch, but I cannot fight the bank and keep my land." James felt the news hit him like a physical blow, the betrayal of being punished not for anything he had done wrong, but simply for existing as an obstacle to Victor Thompson's vindictive rage. His pride was wounded in ways he could not articulate. The knowledge that his competence and dedication meant nothing in the face of financial power, wielded by a man who cared more about petty revenge than justice or fairness. Richard offered him 2 weeks' wages as severance and a letter of recommendation that praised his skills in terms that would have been gratifying under any other circumstances, but James barely heard him through the roaring in his ears. He walked out of the ranch house into the December cold without his coat, needing the bite of winter air to clear his head and force him to think past the rage and desperation that threatened to overwhelm rational thought. He had lost his horse, and now his job, had nothing left except his savings which were depleted from helping Eleanor, and Christmas was 2 days away, which meant finding new employment before spring would be nearly impossible, with most ranches reducing staff for winter rather than hiring. Eleanor learned of James's dismissal from Martha Brennan, who had heard it from Richard Redmond's wife, and the news landed on her like a collapsing building, crushing her under the weight of guilt because she understood immediately that this was Victor's doing and that James was being punished for loving her. She spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling of her small room while snow fell outside, calculating and recalculating options, until she arrived at the only conclusion that made any sense, that she had to remove herself from James's life before Victor destroyed him completely. The letter she wrote at dawn was the hardest thing she had ever composed, each word feeling like a small death as she explained that she had come to realize he deserved someone younger and unencumbered by the complications her presence brought, that she was ending their courtship for his own good, that he should forget her and build the life he deserved with someone who would not cost him everything he had worked for. She left the letter with Martha to deliver, and then dressed in her best grey dress and walked through the December evening to Victor Thompson's house on the edge of town, a large, ostentatious structure that was cold and lifeless despite its expensive furnishings, reflecting the emptiness of the man who lived there. Victor answered the door himself, and his face transformed from surprise to triumph when she said quietly that she had reconsidered his proposal and was prepared to accept his terms. "I knew you would see reason eventually," he said, ushering her into a parlour decorated with furniture too fine for comfort and paintings chosen for their cost rather than their beauty. "A woman like you needs security, and I can provide that, once you put aside this foolish infatuation with a boy who has nothing to offer except rough hands and empty dreams." Eleanor stood in the centre of that cold, beautiful room and felt her soul shrinking inside her, the grief of what she was about to do threatening to choke off her breath, but she forced herself to nod and accept the glass of sherry he poured for her, with hands that shook so badly she nearly dropped it. Victor was explaining the arrangements he had made, how they would marry quietly after Christmas, and she would move into this house and leave her shop behind because a banker's wife did not work, when the front door crashed open with enough of force to shake the walls, and James burst into the parlour with snow in his hair and murder in his eyes. James had gone to Eleanor's shop to confront her about the letter, and found it empty, but Martha Brennan was waiting on the street outside with fear in her eyes and information about where Eleanor had gone, and the knowledge that she was at Victor Thompson's house accepting his proposal sent James running through the snowy streets with his heart pounding and his vision narrowed to a single purpose. He did not knock when he reached that ostentatious house, but kicked the door open hard enough to splinter the frame, and the sight of Eleanor standing in Victor's parlour holding a glass of sherry, while that smug bastard explained their future together, ignited a rage in James that was primitive and absolute. Victor barely had time to set down his own glass before James was on him, fists connecting with flesh in a flurry of blows driven by months of accumulated fury at a man who used his power to destroy others for petty revenge. The fight was brief and brutal, Victor soft from years behind a desk and no match for a young man hardened by ranch work, and within moments the banker was on the floor with blood streaming from his nose while furniture lay overturned around them, and Eleanor screamed for them to stop. The sheriff arrived minutes later, summoned by a Victor's housekeeper who had heard the commotion, and Ben Morgan was a fair man in his 50s who had watched this whole situation unfold with growing disgust at Victor's machinations, but could not ignore an assault in progress. He separated the two men and demanded explanations, and that was when Eleanor broke down completely and confessed through her tears that she had come to accept Victor's proposal to save James from further persecution, that she was trying to protect him by removing herself from his life before Victor destroyed everything he had worked for. James turned on her with fury that was somehow worse than the physical violence he had just unleashed, his voice shaking with hurt and rage as he demanded to know how little she thought of him. "You think so little of me," he said, his words cutting deeper than any blow Victor had landed. "You think I would want to be saved at that cost, that I would rather have my job and my prospects than have you, that I could live with myself knowing you had sacrificed yourself to a man you despised just to spare me hardship." Eleanor tried to explain through her tears that she was trying to do the right thing, but James cut her off with words that rang through the destroyed parlour like a bell. "I would rather have nothing with you than everything without you," he said, and the absolute conviction in his voice made Victor laugh bitterly from where he sat holding his bleeding nose. Sheriff Morgan arrested both men for disturbing the peace despite Eleanor's protest that James had only been defending her honour, and as they were led out into the winter night she stood alone in Victor's cold, beautiful house and understood that her attempt at self-sacrifice had only succeeded in hurting the one person she had been trying to save. Sheriff Ben Morgan put James and Victor in separate cells on opposite sides of his small office, and when Eleanor announced her intention to remain there through the night, he did not have the heart to send her away into the cold December darkness. Victor retreated to the back of his cell, nursing his injuries and his wounded pride, while James gripped the bars of his own cage and stared at Eleanor with eyes that held equal parts anger and desperate love. And gradually, as the hours passed and the single lamp burned low and snow continued to fall outside the windows, they began to talk with the raw honesty that comes when all pretenses have been stripped away. Eleanor pulled a chair close to his cell and finally spoke aloud the fear that had been eating at her soul since the day he first proposed. That she was terrified of taking his youth and his chance at children and a normal life with someone appropriate. That she woke every morning dreading the day he would look at her and realize what he had sacrificed for a woman who could give him nothing except years of watching her age while he remained vital and young. The words poured out of her like poison finally lanced from a wound, all the self-hatred and shame and certainty that she was being selfish by allowing him to love her when he deserved so much better. James listened without interrupting until she had exhausted herself, and then he told her something he had never shared before, that when he was 19 he had loved a girl named Sarah who was young and pretty and full of laughter, and he had saved for 6 months to buy her a ring, only to have her leave him for a merchant's son who could offer her a house in town and a life of ease instead of the hardship of building something from nothing. I learned then that young and shallow breaks your heart just as thoroughly as any other kind of loss, he said quietly, and I swore I would never again mistake surface beauty for real worth. I do not want young and shallow Eleanor. I want depth. I want someone who has lived and suffered and emerged stronger. I want you. The barriers between them crumbled like snow in spring melt, and by the time dawn light began filtering through the bowie frosted windows, they had both arrived at the same crystalline certainty that waiting until April was foolish when they could marry immediately and begin building the life they both wanted with desperate intensity. Martha Brennan arrived at the sheriff's office just as the first light of dawn was breaking through the storm clouds. And she was not alone, but accompanied by a distinguished-looking man in a fine coat who carried a leather case and introduced himself as Samuel Foster, attorney at law from Helena. Sheriff Morgan looked up from his desk where he had been dozing with confusion that turned to alertness, when Martha announced in her no-nonsense voice that she had evidence of criminal activity that would change the complexion of last night's events considerably. Samuel Foster opened his case and produced ledgers that Martha explained she had been collecting for weeks after Victor Thompson's vindictive pursuit of Eleanor had made her suspicious about his motives and his methods, and what they had uncovered was a pattern of embezzlement stretching back 3 years. Victor had been systematically stealing from the bank, small amounts at first but growing bolder as time passed, and he had been covering the missing funds by calling in debts early and foreclosing on properties he could then sell to replenish the accounts before auditors noticed the discrepancies. The doctored ledgers showed one set of numbers for the bank's board of directors and another set that reflected the true state of affairs, and the evidence was so damning that even Victor, from his cell, could not muster a convincing denial. Martha explained that she had suspected something was wrong when Victor had called in Richard Redmond's loan despite Richard's faithful payment history, and she had used her position as a member of the bank's board of directors to access records that Victor thought were safely hidden. The sheriff's office became crowded as witnesses arrived, summoned by the messages Martha had sent the previous evening, including an auditor from Helena, who confirmed that the ledgers showed clear evidence of fraud and theft. Victor Thompson's face went from red to white to grey as he realized that his scheme to destroy James and Eleanor had instead destroyed himself, and Sheriff Morgan unlocked his cell with grim satisfaction and placed him under arrest for embezzlement and fraud, while simultaneously releasing James with an apology for the inconvenience. The vindication Eleanor felt was so intense it made her dizzy, and she gripped the back of her chair while Martha explained that as acting head of the board of directors, she would ensure that Richard Redmond's loan was restructured fairly, and that James Crawford would be offered his position back with an apology for the bank's role in his unjust dismissal. The justice of seeing Victor led away in chains while James walked free was sweeter than Eleanor had imagined possible, and when James emerged from his cell and pulled her into his arms, she finally allowed herself to believe that perhaps they might actually have a future together after all. Outside the sheriff's office, the snow had finally stopped falling and the world was wrapped in that peculiar silence that comes after a storm, everything white and clean and new in the first pale light of dawn. James emerged disheveled from his night in jail, with his shirt torn from the fight and his hair standing in every direction, but his eyes were clear and certain as he took Eleanor's hand and led her down the steps into the pristine snow that covered Main Street like a blessing. Early risers were beginning to appear, shopkeepers opening their doors and ranch hands heading to the livery, and they stopped to watch as James Crawford dropped to one knee in the middle of the street with snow soaking through his trousers and his breath making clouds in the cold air. "Eleanor Hayes," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning quiet, "I am asking you one more time to be my wife. Not because of Victor Thompson or what he tried to do to us, not because of what the town thinks or what anyone else wants, but because I love you more than my next breath, and I cannot imagine spending another day of my life without you by my side. Will you marry me?" Eleanor looked down at him kneeling in the snow with his face turned up toward hers like a flower-seeking sun, and she felt joy so pure and overwhelming that it drove out every fear and doubt and worry that had plagued her for months. "Yes," she said through tears that froze on her cheeks in the December cold. "Yes, I will marry you, but not in spring and not in 6 months, and not after any more waiting. Today, James. I will marry you today." The spontaneous applause that erupted from the gathering crowd started with Martha Brennan, who had followed them out of the sheriff's office and spread to the shopkeepers and ranch hands and early morning travellers who had stopped to witness this unexpected drama. James surged to his feet and pulled Eleanor into his arms, kissing her in full view of everyone with a passion that would have scandalized the town just weeks earlier, but now only drew more applause and a few good-natured cheers. The tide had completely turned, Victor's arrest and the revelation of his crimes casting James and Eleanor's love story in an entirely different light, transforming them from scandal to romance in the span of a single night. People who had shunned Eleanor now called out congratulations. Men who had mocked James now clapped him on the shoulder, and the sense of liberation was so complete that Eleanor threw back her head and laughed, with pure unrestrained joy. Pastor Williams emerged from his house across the street still in his dressing gown, and called out that he would be honoured to perform the ceremony that very afternoon, if they would give him time to make himself presentable, and Martha announced that the celebration would be held at her ranch house, and everyone in town was invited because true love deserved to be celebrated rather than condemned. Pastor Williams agreed to perform the ceremony that very afternoon, and the news spread through Billings with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve, so that by 3 o'clock on Christmas Eve, the small wooden church was packed with every person who could find an excuse to attend. Eleanor wore a simple blue dress she had sewn months ago, in secret hope that this day might actually come, and she carried a bouquet of pine boughs and winter berries that Martha had hastily arranged because no flowers bloomed in December Montana. The church had been decorated for Christmas services with candles glowing on every windowsill, and garlands of evergreen draped across the altar, and the warm light transformed the humble space into something magical and sacred. Martha Brennan stood beside Eleanor as her witness, dressed in her finest black silk and standing proud as any mother of the bride, while Richard Redmond, who had reinstated James that very morning, with profuse apologies and a raise in wages, stood with James and looked nearly as emotional as the groom himself. The crowd was a mixture of their staunch supporters and the simply curious, those who had defended them and those who had condemned them, now united in witnessing what had become the most talked-about wedding in the territory's recent history. Pastor Williams conducted the ceremony with simple dignity, speaking the traditional words about love and commitment and the mystery of two becoming one, and when he asked if anyone objected to this union, the silence was absolute because even those who had doubts recognized that these two people had earned their happiness through fire and trial. James's voice shook when he promised to love and honour Eleanor for as long as they both should live, and Eleanor's hands trembled in his as she made her own vows with tears streaming down her face. But there was no hesitation in either of them, only the overwhelming certainty of two people who had chosen each other against all odds and would continue choosing each other every day for the rest of their lives. When Pastor Williams finally pronounced them husband and wife, and James pulled Eleanor into his arms for their first kiss as a married couple, the church erupted in applause that seemed to shake the rafters, and the sound was so joyous and overwhelming that several people started crying, including Richard Redmond, who wiped his eyes with a handkerchief and tried to pretend he was not deeply moved. They walked down the aisle together, as man and wife, with Eleanor's hand tucked into the crook of James's arm, and smiles so broad their faces ached, and the community that had once condemned them now threw rice and offered blessings, the Christmas Eve wedding feeling like a gift to the entire town as much as to the couple themselves. James had borrowed Richard Redmond's hunting cabin for 3 days, a small rustic structure, 10 miles from town, with a stone fireplace and a bed covered in quilts that smelled faintly of cedar and pine smoke. And he carried Eleanor over the threshold on Christmas Eve, while snow fell softly outside and the world seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Eleanor's nervousness manifested in trembling hands and too bright chatter as she unpacked the small bag Martha had helped her prepare, talking about nothing and everything while avoiding the reality of what came next, and James watched her with patient understanding until finally he crossed the small room and stilled her restless movements by taking her hands in his. "It has been 3 years," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "I do not know if I remember how, and I am not young anymore, not the kind of woman who—" James stopped her words with a gentle finger against her lips, and then cupped her face in his work-roughened hands with a tenderness that made her throat tighten. "You are not old, Eleanor," he said quietly. "You're exactly right, exactly what I want, exactly who I've been waiting for my entire life." What followed was a slow unveiling of bodies and souls, James patient and worshipful as he helped her from the blue dress she had worn to become his wife, his hands reverent as they traced the lines and curves of a woman who carried 35 years of living in her skin. Eleanor felt vulnerable and exposed in ways that had nothing to do with nakedness, and everything to do with allowing herself to be truly seen and wanted, but James's whispered praise and tender kisses gradually melted her self-consciousness until she could touch him in return with wonder and growing confidence. Their union when it came was both tender and passionate, a joining that acknowledged both the physical hunger they had been denying for months and the deeper spiritual connection that had brought them to this moment. And Eleanor found herself crying afterward, not from pain or regret, but from the overwhelming happiness of feeling truly alive for the first time since Henry's death. "I never thought I would feel this again," she said against James's chest, while he held her close and the fire burned low, and Christmas morning arrived in silence and snow. Feel alive, wanted, loved, not as a duty or an obligation, but as a genuine desire. James pulled the quilts over them both and kissed her forehead with infinite gentleness, and in the warm cocoon of the rustic cabin, while the rest of the world slept, they whispered promises and dreams, and held each other with the complete trust of two people who had finally found their home in each other's arms. Summer arrived in 1885 with the kind of golden warmth that made winter's hardships seem like distant memories, and James and Eleanor Crawford stood on the 40 acres they had finally purchased with their combined savings, and looked at the house frame rising against the blue Montana sky with a sense of disbelief that anything this good could actually be real. The community had turned out for the barn raising the previous week, men from every ranch within 20 miles arriving with tools and lumber and good-natured ribbing about how the young cowboy had won himself the best woman in the territory. And now the skeletal outline of their future home stood proud on the land James had dreamed about for 5 years. Eleanor's garden was already planted and thriving in the rich soil near the creek, rows of beans and carrots and tomatoes promising abundance, and in the newly built corral 3 horses grazed peacefully, including the gelding James had sold to pay her mortgage and then repurchased with his first wages after being reinstated at the ranch. But the most miraculous development was the one Eleanor still could not quite believe. Even though Dr. Harrison had confirmed it twice, she was pregnant at 36 years old after 15 years of barrenness with Henry and 3 years of widowhood that had convinced her that motherhood would never be part of her story. The doctor had explained in his gentle way that sometimes severe stress and grief could prevent conception, that the body protected itself from bringing new life into circumstances of unbearable hardship, and that the happiness and security she had found with James had apparently healed whatever had been broken inside her all those years. Eleanor stood with her hand pressed against her still flat belly, and felt tears streaming down her face as James came up behind her ear and wrapped his arms around her waist, both of them staring at the house that would shelter their child and the land that would be their legacy. "I thought my life was over," Eleanor whispered, leaning back against her husband's solid warmth. "When Henry died, I thought I had used up all my chances for happiness, that the rest of my years would be nothing but slow decline into invisible old age. You showed me it was just beginning." James turned her in his arms and kissed her with the same tender passion that had characterized their marriage from that first night in the cabin, and Eleanor marveled at how thoroughly wrong she had been about everything. She was not too old at 36, not used up or past her prime or any of the things the town had called her when she had dared to be loved by a younger man. She was exactly the right age to be standing here on this land with this man and this impossible, miraculous baby growing inside her, and the future that stretched ahead of them felt limitless and golden as the summer sky above Montana Territory. Spring returned to Montana Territory in 1887 with the gentle warmth that promised new beginnings, and Eleanor Crawford sat on the porch of the house she and James had built together, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold while her daughter Mary played at her feet, and the second child she carried made its presence known with gentle movements beneath her ribs. She was 38 years old now, and James was 26, but the age difference that had once been the subject of endless town gossip was never mentioned anymore except occasionally by Eleanor herself, in moments of lingering insecurity that James patiently dismissed each time they arose. The horse ranch was thriving beyond their initial dreams, James's skill with training bringing buyers from as far as Helena and beyond, while Eleanor had built a modest business designing fine dresses from their home and shipping them to shops in the territorial capital where wealthy women paid premium prices for her elegant work. Victor Thompson had fled Montana immediately after his embezzlement trial, rumors placing him in California, or perhaps Mexico, but no one in Billings wasted much thought on a man who had tried to use his power to destroy good people and had instead destroyed only himself. The community that had once condemned Eleanor and James now pointed to them as an example of true love overcoming adversity, their story told and retold until it had taken on the qualities of legend. The young cowboy who loved the older widow enough to sacrifice everything, and the woman who had been brave enough to accept that gift despite her fears. Mary toddled over to her father, who sat in the rocking chair he had built with his own hands, and James lifted their daughter onto his lap with the easy competence of a man who had taken to fatherhood as naturally as he had taken to everything else in his life. Eleanor watched them together, and felt her heart swell with contentment so complete it was almost painful. 18 months of watching James be a father, having proven what she had always suspected, that he had more love to give than most men accumulated in a lifetime. The evening air was soft and filled with the scent of the garden Eleanor had planted along the south side of their house, and in the corral beyond the barn she could see the horses moving peacefully in the twilight, their ranch everything they had dreamed it could be and more. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked suddenly, the old fear rising unbidden as it sometimes did. "Choosing an old woman when you could have had anyone you wanted?" James looked at her over their daughter's head with eyes that held nothing but absolute certainty and reached out his free hand to cover hers where it rested on the curve of her belly. "Every day I thank God you let me choose you," he said quietly. "And you are not old, Eleanor. You are timeless." The family sat together on their porch as the sun sank toward the mountains, and Mary's laughter rang out over the land they had built together. And in that moment Eleanor Crawford understood with perfect clarity that the life she had thought was ending at 35 had actually been waiting to begin. That sometimes the greatest love stories start not with youth and certainty but with maturity and courage and the willingness to believe that happiness can come at any age if you're brave enough to reach for it when, it appears,